Okay, colleagues, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming back from coffee break as we move into the last discussion session of the afternoon, which of course is on a topic that's of great interest to many people in the energy efficiency sector, which is the matter of finance. Now, we had a couple of polls during the afternoon that I invited you to join us on. I'm just going to pull them up there if I can find them. Apologies. I might have to hold those until I can actually find them. Oh no, there it is, sorry. This is, smartphones are your young person's technology. They're a bit beyond me. So we asked you about what is preventing greater investment in energy efficiency. And among the answers, the two leading answers were lack of appropriate business models to drive investment and lack of investor confidence in returns from energy efficiency. So I think that might be something that we pick up. I suspect there's no surprise to our panelists here. We also asked you, is there sufficient capital available to fund a scaling up of energy efficiency? And interestingly, 69% of people say, yes, there is sufficient capital available. So I think that will be an interesting theme to pick up as well among our colleagues. So we have another 5 excellent panelists for you. Thank you very much. And we'll follow the same style, which I'll ask our panelists to make a short opening statement, tell us a bit about themselves and any points they want to raise. And then we'll widen out the discussion. And again, you'll be very welcome to participate. And equally, privileged access comes via #EnergyEfficientWorld on Twitter. And if you want to ask a question by that medium, we'll take it. But we'll also try and take some questions and discussion from the floor. So let's go into our 5 panelists. First of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome Gordon Banyai to join us. He's currently chairman of the Global Advisory Boards of Campbell Lutyens. He'll tell you more about that. Prior to that, he was the COO of Meridian Capital, where he's still the chair of the supervisory board. And you'll hear why both of those roles are very relevant to this discussion in a minute. Before, he had the easy life of being Prime Minister of Hungary, but that wasn't challenging enough, so he decided to get into energy efficiency finance instead. So Gordon, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to this highly relevant, and I think we'll go into the history books as a first on energy efficiency congregation. I have 2-3 minutes, so I'd like to make statements. I think there are 4 questions to ask. Is how much money is needed? Is this money available? And then going into the challenges, where does politics stand on supporting private participation in the energy efficiency sector? And if politics is accommodative, then what are the regulatory environment issues and challenges that can stop money flowing there? And I was very pleased with the result of your questions because they reflect on these points that I just raised. I would certainly say that a lot of money is needed based on COP21 or just pure rational thinking. There are different numbers in the air. The IEA has probably the best numbers, but one that I often quote is just for the European Union. The European Commission says annually 200 billion should be invested in COP21 compatible goals. That's not only energy efficiency, but 200 billion per annum until 2030 to meet the European Union own goals. So that's a huge amount of money, and we know that 50% of energy saving or COP21 goals should be reached by energy efficiency. That's an IEA figure. So that's the biggest chunk. And of the 200 billion, they estimate that 40% should be used in buildings, another 15% in industry, energy efficiency. This is, again, European Union numbers, estimates. Around 23% in grids and 23% in new green power generation. So you see that energy efficiency, even within the European Union, is the largest part of the money to be spent. So the need is tremendous. Now, the second question, is there money available? My simple answer is yes, there is. I see it from 2 of my capacities. The company Campbell Lutyens is collecting money from the 2,500 largest end investors in the world for infrastructure and private equity funds. And also with my Meridian hat, we have a fund which is specifically investing in energy transition COP21 related energy transition goals. So I see that the money is there. There is roughly $75 trillion managed by pension funds and insurance companies and the largest investors around the world. They have a big problem of placing that money because of the low interest rates around the world. So they are keen to find new ways, alternative investments. And infrastructure, and within that, the COP21 goals and energy efficiency could be obviously one of the most attractive investment targets if, and here is your questionnaire, if the business models are found and the investor confidence in returns can somehow be established. And then, before we get to those regulatory issues, the prior question to be solved is politics ready to let private sector go into this very public sphere of energy efficiency, which is socially very sensitive and economically very sensitive, and there are a lot of long-term national strategy related to it. It's very different in different countries, but without politics making the decision, yes, in a regulated form, this is possible and we want it, and we are ready to take the debate to allow private sector to invest. And we are ready to take the debate to create regulation and structures for some kind of a PPP, public-private cooperation. This will not happen because regulators, technocrats, can only regulate if the politics allows them. So that's the number one issue. In some countries it exists, more and more countries, but in many places it's lacking or turning back if there is a bad experience. And finally, regulatory. What are the biggest problems looking from the money point of view? Let me just put two of them on the table. One is scale, the size of projects. Just a French number. In France, in the coming years, there is roughly 30 billion euros needed just to fix public buildings from energy efficiency point of view. 30 billion. That's a big amount, manageable, but the problem is that the average size of the project is 1 million euro per building. So for investors to invest cheap money into this, and therefore make the investment cheap, the 1 million is not an amount that they can manage. The cost is much bigger on managing that. You need to assemble, to bundle, to package big enough projects to reach critical size. Another example, again from France, this modernization of district heating, which is around 5% in France, 50% in Sweden and Poland. So there's a lot of room there where it could grow. District heating, an average small city district heating project costs around 6 to 10 million euros to modernize and make it more energy efficient. That's still very small to reach the economies of scale, which could make private funding cheap enough. So scale is definitely one issue. The other is how to create a regulatory environment which gives a long term, because these projects have long returns, 10, 15, 20 years, calculable, reliable, stable return. There have been many cases recently in the renewable sector where investors suffered from sudden change in regulations. The European Energy Charter is now trying to provide some protection against that. But regulatory stability is probably the number one issue to get solved to create business models that can work in this sector. At Meridian, we are working on pilot projects in residential bundling, in industrial energy efficiency projects, in district heating and cogeneration. So there are existing examples that are ongoing in our practice, but I'll leave it to the discussion to go into those details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we certainly will come back to those examples. But on this question of scale, Gordon, somebody like you wants to invest very large amounts, and as you say, the projects are too small, somebody needs to bundle them in the middle. Why aren't there more companies operating in that space? Why isn't there a massive sector out there? There are some examples. You hear of people who are aggregators and things like that, but surely there's a bigger opportunity there. Is it a policy issue, or is it just a question of that there's not enough awareness? Surely there's a place for some kind of actor in the middle of that equation.
There are companies. If you think about the ESCO companies, which is a very broad definition and everybody understands different things on that, but the ESCO was an attempt globally or in many countries to create such a bundling model. The problem with the ESCOs, it's very difficult to measure the impact. And very often what we need in energy efficiency, especially when you talk about buildings, that there is the energy part, and then there are other parts of the investment which are required by the building, which are not directly related to energy. But you want to fix other problems with old buildings. So you need you need business models or regulations, and you need willing state or sub-state by local government sponsors who are ready to look into the complexities, carve out the part that needs to be returned to the private sector, and then manage the public sector part. And this requires a lot of thinking and also sophistication. So one of the propositions that I put on the table, without going into details, I think every country, or probably sitting at the IEA, all the IEA countries would need a kind of hub of intelligence on this subject, giving back best practices, case studies, regulations, distributing this around the members of the IEA or the target countries of the IEA, because that could really help. The other thing is some kind of a guarantee fund or something that is able to mitigate regulatory risk. That would move incredible amounts of capital, like MIGA in the World Bank, the Multilateral Insurance Guarantee Fund. If we could create something for this internationally, that would again mobilize major amounts of capital.
Okay. Thank you. That ties in nicely to our conversation earlier about Global Exchange Hub, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that again. Now, our next panelist, I think, is well known to most of you, been prominently involved in this field for many years, and is Managing Director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Does a lot of work in many parts of the world on energy efficiency investment. So, Josue Tanaka, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. So I think I'll try to give a few points based on experience. I think I was asked to contribute in terms of, based on our work, what we believe to be some ingredients of success, and also to reflect some elements of failure and lessons learned. So to start in an exciting way, I'll start with the positive, and then we can move into the more difficult afterwards. In terms of the background, what we work on, essentially, we've developed very much, I would say, an energy efficiency business within the bank. It accounts essentially for the last 6 to 7 years for between 25% and 30% of total investment of the BRD. So that's about $3 billion a year in energy efficiency. Our money, if you count the money that we mobilize together with our partners, you're probably talking about 10 billion, 12 billion a year just in energy efficiency. Number of projects, about 120,000 projects, ranging from sizes that Gordon would look as probably beyond what can be perceived, you know, $1,000, sub-loans in residential energy efficiency, all the way to some mega projects of $750 million. So there is a huge range in what we do. So let me go quickly on the 4 ingredients that we see are important in terms of building this business. The first one is obvious. It's been mentioned very much all day long. Is a famous P word, the policy element. There I would put 2 types of elements. One that was mentioned by several speakers this morning is energy prices. Because at the end of the day, any calculation on energy efficiency investment is essentially based, you know, on the price of energy that you're saving. The second point is one on standards regulation that also has been mentioned by all today, and essentially are market-making mechanisms, and in the absence of those, you know, you obviously have a big limitation in terms of the speed and the scale at which you can build your activities. 2 comments I'll make so we have a lively discussion. In our experience, the role of the private sector in energy efficiency is actually, we don't perceive much of a discussion. Because in fact it's more a way of how you interact and work with the private sector than it is an issue of having, for example, government sensitivity on having the private sector. I think when we deal, for example, with energy generations question, then we see those questions much more prominent. Or if you deal with I don't know, privatization of the distribution, then you have those difficulties. But in terms of energy efficiency, one of the beauties, but one of the difficulties also, is that you really literally have thousands, dozens of thousands of opportunities. And therefore, in those governments, as control-oriented as they may be, are not really able, I think, to influence fully, the ability to work with the private sector. So policy is the first one. The second one, it's a business that requires knowledge and that requires investment on our part, those that finance this business, to understand. There is no, again, it's the beauty but the difficulty of energy efficiency. It's that, it's essentially opportunities are in all sectors, but sectors are different. And if you're trying to exploit an energy efficiency opportunity in transport, technically it's a very different business from essentially working in buildings or essentially working with utilities, etc. And that is what makes the business model a difficult proposal, because the business model has to reflect the features of the sectors that you are working with, and particularly technical features. And I have to say, even though I've been at EBRD since Gordon was reminding me since the beginning, okay, financiers generally focus on finance. They often don't like to, to spend too much money on the technical side. In energy efficiency, you have to spend the money on the technical side, because otherwise it's very difficult, to do the business in a meaningful manner. The third topic has been mentioned by Gordon, is essentially this issue of aggregation. How do you build up, right? The famous expression, from billions to trillions. Well, okay, how do you manage that if you're working, with projects, of, okay, I don't say 1,000, but you mentioned 1 million. In many cases, 1 million in many of the works that we do is actually already quite a large and, medium-sized energy efficiency project. So the fourth element becomes very much the channels, right? And the channels are linked to this question of business model. Who can we work with? That can be this intermediary to work. One of the key channels we've developed over the years are banks. Okay, so we work today with probably 120 private banks in the countries of operation. They play that role, if you want, of the intermediation and of, I would say, the aggregation. We have tried to work with utilities. I have to say that every time the previous panel with the California Commission, I always feel somewhat envious, right? That, okay, we don't have many California regulatory commissions in the countries in which we work that have actually managed to have a regulatory framework that decouples, if you want, the revenue generation from the volume that is sold. The last one, and then I'll stop for now, we'll leave the negative and the difficulties for later, are the ESCOs, right? That's often in this business that we do energy efficiency, one of the solutions. Again, I listened to the presentation by Shen Wu with envy, in the sense that, okay, in our experience in the countries that we work in, there is no Shen Wu, and therefore we've not been able to really use ESCOs as a mean to scale up energy efficiency financing. So I think I'll stop here, but...
Thank you very much. On that point of energy pricing, which is your first kind of policy lever, it's a kind of a tough ask for policymakers to use energy pricing as a means to encourage energy efficiency, isn't it?
Well, I think there it's all about the opportunity cost, right? Because, as you know, many countries, at least in many countries in which we work, still have subsidies. So budget money is being used for something. And often the argument we're making is, okay, there are other ways that your money can be used that actually would have a double benefit. One, for your fiscal balance, and number two, to provide the, better incentives for energy efficiency, and for those countries that are importing their energy to reduce energy dependency and enhance energy security.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's turn to our third panelist now, who is Jaco Minar, who's Director of Energy and Climate at Triodos Investment Management. I think the company is well known to many of us. Jaco, you're very welcome. Please, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon. 3 minutes only, but let me first tell you a little bit about Triodos. Last year, 2016, we financed 70 projects in the renewable energy space, and by Clean Energy Pipeline, we're named the largest deal maker. $568 million of deals. On the one hand, that makes me very proud. On the other hand, I'm sitting here because most of those deals were in renewable energy power generation. And we also know and realize, just like you, that we need to do much more on energy efficiency, and only a couple of those deals were in energy efficiency. So we can see that we still have a huge challenge ahead of us there. If we look at energy efficiency and, in fact, the energy transition in general, I totally concur with some of the previous speakers that the amount of finance itself is not the problem. In fact, money has never been so cheap. I mean, we just don't know, where to allocate it. The problem is investability. The problem is finding investable projects. So whomever comes to you and tells you we need more money, please do ask that question. Then where are the projects and how are we going to make them more investable? As I am a banker and investor, I like to talk about money, and I think we also have to distinguish between the different types of money that are needed. Because if we want to develop those projects, there will be different phases. In a development phase, we need money that can take higher risk than by the time we have a project that we can actually leverage at financial close. And what we see is that there is a lack of entrepreneurs in that development phase. There is a lack of entrepreneurs who put equity on the table so that all of that money that we have can actually get to work and finally leverage projects. If I look at the kind of projects that we do, then I would also like to distinguish between the on-balance sheet financing that we can do, where we finance companies or individuals, if it is their house, directly, and off-balance sheet financing. Because what I see is that on the on-balance sheet side, it really depends on whether the individual and the company has the appetite to do this kind of project. There is often an issue there. Sometimes it is awareness, but more often it is because this energy efficiency project has to compete with other priorities that may be higher on the list because they are closer to the core business, whether it is a person who'd rather invest in comfortability of its house or luxury, or it is a company that can actually improve its core process. What we see is that energy efficiency often doesn't make the cut in terms of making the priority list. And of course, if you want to finance on balance sheet, then you also need a strong balance sheet. And some companies, some individuals have that, others don't. Summarizing, one could say that if you can do it on balance sheet, it is relatively easy. But that's where we get to the off-balance sheet solution, which in the case of energy efficiency often takes the form of an ESCO. And there we see that that sector hasn't really taken off in a very large way. And just to name a few of the things that I then actually encounter, I think we need to really work on the entrepreneurs in this space. Why do I say that? Because very often the kind of projects that are presented to us come from the technical side, sort of the consultancy side. You actually calculate all the savings, but that doesn't make it a business case unless there is somebody standing behind it and says, I want to put that first euro on the table. Can you now please co-invest with me or leverage my plan? Then there is a bit about the performance gap still. We see that the reliability of the calculations in energy efficiency are not yet at the standard where they are in wind or in solar or other technologies. And there is also an additional risk that we have in these type of projects as we are talking about savings. It means that the underlying companies have to survive these long terms to actually pay us back. We do not have step-in rights, because if the building that we have just made more energy efficient is vacant, then there are no savings to be made anymore. Does that mean, I think later on we can talk a bit more about the kind of solutions. Does it mean that I'm negative about this sector? No, I'm sitting here because I'm ambitious. And I'm also sitting here because I think about 20 years ago we had exactly this same discussion on wind energy. About 10 years ago, we had exactly this same discussion on solar energy, and I'm hoping in the next 10 years we will solve it for energy efficiency.
Good. We're keeping the tone positive, which is great. How much do you think the future of this kind of lending is in kind of specialist banks like yours who understand this sector and decide to focus on it, or mainstream across all kinds of banks who just start to tune into this particular sector?
I think this sector is quite specialized, so I think we will see a lot of specialized lending and investment. Does that mean that the general institutions cannot finance this? No, it doesn't, because either through securitizing or to other ways they will fund it, but they will either have to invest in building up this specific capacity, or they will have to leverage on the capacity of others.
Okay, thank you very much. Some themes we'll definitely be coming back to. So our next speaker is our friend and colleague, part of our energy efficiency community here in Paris, Benoit Lebeau, who's the Executive Director of IPEC, the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation. Benoit.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the IEF for inviting us to address. So IPEC is the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation. It's a platform through which 17 of the G20 countries exchange information, good practices, and find ways to work together on energy efficiency. 3 years ago, we received a mandate from the G20 through the Australian-led G20 Energy Efficiency Action Plan, a series of collaboration to enhance energy efficiency activities in the member countries of the G20. And one of the task group under the G20 Energy Efficiency Action Plan that was transformed into the G20 Energy Efficiency Leading Program under Chinese presidency, because energy efficiency needs the long term, is finance. And a special group of countries led by France and Mexico have brought together two communities that need to talk more: the energy efficiency community and the finance community. As we just heard, the world is not short of financiers, and finance is available, and even cheap finance. On the other hand, we just know from the energy efficiency side that not only we need to maintain investment in energy efficiency, but we need to seriously scale up investment. It's a factor 5 that we need in terms of scaling up of investment just for the 2-degree scenario according to the IEA in the coming years. And we cannot expect the finance partner to not invest in energy efficiency if they don't understand what that is or if they don't see the benefits. And this is why it's good to have this high-level dialogue under the umbrella of the G20 to bring together the two communities. And a series of exchange through a workshop and direct dialogue has led this year to the publication of a toolkit, the G20 Energy Efficiency Toolkit, that summarizes 3 years of work, of dialogue, that propose a series, for example, of 5 principles that have been accepted by the G20 energy ministers, the G20 energy investment principles to make energy efficiency visible and part of the investment decision process. This toolkit also survey all existing database reporting energy efficiency program and policy. And for each of the 10,000 different projects and policies that have been identified through this very dense and analysis of the past portfolio of energy efficiency, they have been analyzed. This is the 5 principles. And some lessons are being proposed and being learned. And I invite you to have a look, because I have no time to go through the most recommendations, but at least now there is a dialogue that exists. This dialogue at the G20 led by France and Mexico is heavily relying from the good progress on a similar dialogue in Europe that was mentioned this morning, the Energy Efficiency Finance Institution Group, EFIG. And there is a series of propositions that are being made and a way forward to just organize to structure, to make sure that the dialogue takes place, that exchange are being done. And I just take one example that we have learned progressively in this community, the value, the beauty of harmonizing or at least discussing energy efficiency performance standard for this or that equipment. We have more or less have an international dialogue. We now need to make a similar effort to standardize financial tools that supports energy efficiency, the granular dimension of energy efficiency, and bring that together. All countries are facing the same challenge. At least now there is a platform through which there is progress being made. This is work in progress. The toolkit is just one step. You heard this morning from Mr. Arhan Goura from Argentina that the work will continue under the Argentinian presidency of the G20. We see a lot of possibility for enhancing the dialogue on this very important topic that all countries face. And there is certainly more to be done, and I hope that this dialogue today is one contribution to the continuation of this very important piece of dialogue. Not an easy one, but so much needed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. From a policymaker's perspective in regards to the toolkit, would you like to highlight one tool in that big toolkit that you think is maybe one of the more crucial for policymakers to think about to enable greater levels of investment?
The most interesting lessons that I've learned through this work, this dialogue with a financial institution, that we just heard that, they need a long-term stable policy environment. And certainly for us, the energy efficiency community, this is what we have been begging for and asking and ready for. And that's a very interesting lesson that we can directly learn, as it's a demand from the financial institutions. And this is, I think, to be heard. And we have just to do more in terms of putting in place an enabling environment, putting in place the capacity, all the instruments to collect data, analyze, we have to mainstream also some specific technical instruments and financial instruments. We just have to do more. But now we have an excuse because the financial institution, they need that.
Okay, thank you very much. So our fifth panelist is Professor Kevin Chika Urama. He works with the African Development Bank Group, where he's Senior Advisor to the President on the topic of inclusive and green growth. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank IEA for giving us the opportunity to share our views and experiences in this sector. For us at the bank, we see energy efficiency more as a very cross-cutting issue, where we think about efficiency from generation, distribution, consumption, and in all the energy sector value chains. Reason being that for Africa, one of the major focus of the bank is actually scaling up access, reaching universal access to energy services for all by 2025. And given that a lot of Africans, over 634 million, have no access to electricity, using less energy to do more simply means that we save more to reach more people without spending more money and investing more on that. So one could say that what drives energy inefficiency in Africa is actually lack of access to energy. A lot of Africans, as we know, use poor energy sources, biomass, inefficient cooking stoves, inefficient transport systems, decommissioned cars from Europe and America comes to Africa as grade 1 imported cars and so on. So the whole question of energy inefficiency is related to the whole value chain of production and consumption systems on the continent. So we try to building energy efficiency in all programs that we do, whether it's in infrastructure investments, in agriculture, or in the energy sector. So for the bank, what we've then done is to develop the New Deal on Energy for Africa, which the bank launched last year, and is investing $12 billion over the next 10 years, hoping to leverage 45 to 50 billion for the sector. And within this, energy efficiency has been made one of the 9 flagship programs that the bank is trying to focus on. And we've also formed a new directorate on energy efficiency and renewable energy, just to ensure that there are dedicated teams that are focusing on making sure that in all investments that the bank engages in, whether in the energy sector or in all the other sectors, that energy efficiency is mainstreamed as part of the whole process. This for us is crucial because we are starting from a very low base in terms of energy access and access to a lot of the other things that are required. So when we talk of investments in energy efficiency on the continent, for us in the bank, we're actually thinking about mainstreaming that throughout all the investment sectors that we are working on. So like I've said, the overall goal is to look from the beginning to the end of the energy sector and try to make sure that we improve efficiency as we go forward. And this leads me to a call to partnerships. On the behalf of the bank, we are aware that this is a very cross-cutting issue, it's a big agenda, and a lot of continents and institutions have more experiences in dealing with this. So we have developed a transformative partnership on energy for Africa, within which we're already talking with IEA, for example, on the energy efficiency issues with regard to knowledge and policy dialogues and training for our countries. We've also developed a number of financing platforms. We're working with the SC for All. We also have a Sustainable Energy for Africa that we call CEFA, Climate Innovation Funds. All these kinds of funds we have been working with and more increasingly developing specific funds for energy efficiency, projects for energy efficiency in countries like in Liberia. We just launched what we call LEAP, the Liberia Energy Efficiency and Access Project. And in other programs that we're doing, like I've said, we always try to mainstream energy efficiency in that. Let me come to what we've learned in terms of the 4 key areas that we have been asked to talk about. The business model. It derives from this concept of what energy efficiency is for us. The business model of what is then an energy efficiency project becomes something that is a little bit amorphous in our view. And when we try to focus on energy efficiency in generation area, what we find that keeps coming up is to use the mini-grids, off-grids, and renewable energy options, which often come in very small project packages. And this leads a lot of questions that countries are asking because they're also thinking about gaining efficiency by large-scale energy production. So clean coal technologies comes to question, large hydros comes to question. But the challenge that we have is that these also tend to have being efficient in the environmental and sustainability questions. So how to square that is something that we will be looking for help and support and collaboration in trying to make that work. Knowledge and capacities is also an issue, especially with regard to developing bankable energy efficiency programs and projects. So this is an area that has been mentioned, so I won't dwell on that for too much. Now, we keep hearing, there's enough money. I also answered that there's enough money to invest in energy efficiency. But that is the same question that answer you get for almost any sector that you talk about. When you are talking about $75 trillion that just been mentioned here. But the question for us in Africa is why is it not flowing to the right places? Quite often, some of these funds flow to places that receive negative interest rates. And the areas where we actually know that we can leverage both the environmental gains of not channeling countries to take pathways to more unsustainable pathways of development because they use the little money they have to get the technologies available that is affordable to them because some of these clean technologies are always much more expensive. Even if you're talking of clean coal technologies that are much more expensive. So my question for the group here will be, what can we do to make sure that these monies flow to the right places to deliver bigger global gains and also even more financial returns for the investors? But that's quickly, people will talk about the political and policy risks that are there, and that leads to another issue about work on policy-based operations to help countries to build institutions, regulatory environments that can be implemented, and also have the capacities, the people, to be able to implement these regulatory environments, even standards, to ensure that we can create the environment where these funds can actually flow more reliably. So the regulations and standards and knowledge and institutions become a very key issue. Specifically in the energy sector, one of the major aspects of energy inefficiency that require investment in Africa is actually the utilities themselves. So I haven't heard a lot talked about utilities when we talk about the good examples of California and so on. A lot of utilities in Africa are actually not bankable. So what do we do to ensure that we'll be able to create utilities that can drive efficient pricing, efficient collection, so that will reduce non-revenue energy? And all these things bear to how investments and flow to the African continent with regard to energy efficiency. And knowing that Africa is a growth hub where growth is, there's still huge opportunities for growing the economies, there's huge opportunities for damaging the environment, or actually creating a new pathway of development, an inclusive and green growth pathway that will be able to mitigate climate change questions, then I think it's a good cause for us all to think about how to help the continent to be able to do more efficient development pathways that are not only energy efficient, but also climate efficient.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When you talk about investing in efficiency in renewables, Jaco was making the point that we're further on in investment in renewables, and this came up in the last panel, that renewables is more understandable, more tangible. Do you face the same issue? Do you think that it's at this point in the curve, it's easier to invest in renewables than in efficiency?
So far, investments in renewables are taking off in Africa. The major challenge that comes there, especially from the governments, is the size of the investments. In terms of, they normally come on small projects, and governments want base load energy that is able to drive industrialization and so on. So that brings a big question that is actually may slow down the investment in renewables over time. It's being driven mainly by the private sector at the moment, but also the private sector come with a lot of requests, including tax holidays. And that also leads to the questions about, are we trying to retrofit or reintroduce energy subsidies, which we know is a major, I mean, from an economics point of view, is a major driver of inefficient use of any product. Any product that's actually subsidized cannot be used efficiently. So if we also subsidize renewable energy, we are going to get into the same kind of inefficient use of the energy services that is provided. So these two key questions keep coming back when we're trying to push renewables in countries. But through private sector-led interventions, it's actually scaling up on the continent.
Okay, thank you. Joseph.
Perhaps two further points to your questions, Brian. One on the question that you've just asked. I think it's very interesting to see that for many of the multilateral development banks, the renewable energy financing opportunity is actually in many cases moving away already, because the market essentially is picking it up, and because you have enough opportunity in terms of the confidence in the return, etc., that those things are happening. So it depends on the geography, depends on the country, depends on the risk perception by the investors, but we do see already in a way that move, which is not happening on energy efficiency yet. And I think that was very much, Jaco's point when he made the point about the 10-year slices, and things moving. I think to another of your questions, Brian, when you asked Jaco about what would it take, to get more financial institutions to get into this, I think our experience is the following, that I think you have two elements that play there. One, the technical capacity point, and the second point is Gordon's point when he said about confidence in the risk. And the bridge between these two is actually how do you translate in a clear fashion and in an efficient fashion that technical gain that you get from energy efficiency into a financial proposal. And essentially, our whole business at EBRD on energy efficiency financing is built actually on having, I would say, identified that mechanism and work on that mechanism. You know, in Morocco, I looked at Mr. Moulin, or, you know, even in the questions that we've had at lunch discussions with Brazil or with Mexico, it's all about how do you get, you know, that happening in as broad a way as possible. And we see there a role, actually a very nice role, of public sector and private, because the public sector can put relatively little money on actually helping that process of translating technical into financial savings. And once the banks understand that, they will do it by themselves. And that's our experience with the 120 banks.
Gordon, you might have a point on that, but I also want to come back to an interesting point Kevin raised about what is an energy efficiency project and that definition, because this is something you talk about. Does it matter whether you call an investment energy efficiency or it's part of something wider? Or maybe you could say something about that in terms of, again, do people want to invest in energy efficiency? Do they want to invest in upgrades? You know, what kind of language even do we use to discuss this?
Let me answer that, but just give one reflection on what Joshua and Kevin mentioned. Kevin mentioned that money is actually not flowing into the poorer countries, despite the fact that the return on that money is much higher. But this is what they call now the Lukas Dilemma, because Professor Lukas published a report which actually has shown that the net flows of money is away, coming out of those countries, not just not flowing there, but money coming from the poorer countries towards the more developed countries, despite the fact that poorer countries offer much larger returns. And why is that? And it's a whole article I don't want to repeat. But one clear issue is risk, perceived risk or real risk. You only know whether it's real after you realize that. But, and here I'd just like to go back for one sentence to the issue I mentioned, and where Meridian has actually published recently a recommendation to create by international finance institutions a green mega insurance that would focus on energy efficiency and renewable projects in the poorer countries, the developing countries, and would create specific multilateral guarantees for those projects that are key there. Because if you think about it, saving a unit of carbon in Burkina Faso is equal in global value as saving that in the United States. There is no difference in that. So then we should try to promote this. And this green MIGA, what I call it, it could be created by institutions like the Africa Development Bank or EBRD for their respective areas. And the EBRD had a fantastic innovation in Turkey recently with one of the hospital projects, where Turkey, which was downgraded last year by the rating agencies to below investment grade, has actually, through financial innovation, special tailored targeted guarantees by the EBRD and MIGA as a combination, was moved 2 notch above, so 1 notch above investment grade, and thereby facilitated an influx of 500 million euros in a specific project. These kind of things could turn back the Lukas dilemma in the right direction. So that's one comment. The second, your question, defining energy efficiency. I think financial investors are less worried about the definition than the actual impact of that investment and the actual return and risk-return ratio of that investment. So the problem is not so much how do you define energy efficiency, as long as there is a workable business model. But one thing I was trying to refer to, very often energy efficiency is not a standalone project, but it goes into hand in hand with, for example, upgrading buildings which have other problems than pure energy efficiency. So then you have to make sure that the money is not only titled as energy efficiency, but it finances the whole rejuvenation of a building, or ideally a district or a large number of buildings. And then the financing is insensitive to the energy efficiency part and the non-energy efficiency part. The problem is very often the structure of the regulator. That one regulator can only look at energy efficiency. They can't deal with the non-energy aspect of that. So the regulation will not be able to deal with that. And very often it's the local government who would be able to assess if it's a public building or a private residential project, then it's the local government who could assess all the complexities of that. So it's very often the Weberian bureaucratic sociological problem that defines the regulatory challenge.
Okay. I'm going to take Jaco and Jose very briefly, please, because I do want to involve the floor, please.
Yeah, and I just want to react to what was just being said, because we also invest in emerging markets. So we are confronted almost on a daily basis with this discussion about the risks and the perceived risks. I mean, the perceived risks are certainly there with most investors, where we find it much more difficult to attract funds for these geographies. In my personal opinion, a relatively large part of those risks are perceived and will not be real. But as my neighbor just said, we can really have that discussion once we've realized it. So I think the suggestion of a green MIGA or other forms of local or international credit enhancement can be a very important step in the next 10 years to get this sector to a different scale. And if at the same time we manage to standardize more of those projects, because right now indeed the definition is amorphous, because there are many different types of sectors and there are many different types of projects. That's not going to go away. But for each of these type of projects, if you are an investor, you know what you are talking about. And within those projects, we have to strive for some kind of standardization so we can get to scale. What will happen then is that the costs of actually financing such a project will go down over time. The need for this credit enhancement will go down over time. And in 10 years' time, we will be sitting here the same we are now looking at solar and wind.
Okay, Jose.
Yeah, very quickly. I think in terms of the question you asked about the type of projects, I think we need to distinguish a bit. In practice, you have two approaches on the energy efficiency, at least based on our experience. You have top-down, in which we may discuss with the government, for example, that we build a specific facility for energy efficiency financing that will obviously focus on what I would say pure play energy efficiency financing. However, if you look on what I would call bottom-up, and when you talk private sector, that's what it is. You don't control. I have to say that there we don't see yet much pure play energy efficiency. And in fact, the work that we have to do is how do you develop the energy efficiency opportunity within a firm that wants to expand its production capacity, that wants to double it. And it's that whole dialogue that we have with them, in particular, to demonstrate that the energy efficiency opportunity may have an IRR that's higher than the original project they have. That's where you start. And I think the second point we need to be a bit careful also is that you do need to have the capacity to demonstrate what that energy efficiency component is delivering, and in a certain way to have an MRV, because if tomorrow we want to develop green bonds in energy efficiency, we're going to have something that can be basically reliably reported on.
Thanks. Let's go to the floor and take a couple of questions or comments. One over here to my left. I'll take a few, so I think there's another one over on this side. Please.
Hi, thank you, Brian, and thank you for the panel, particularly because every member of the panel was a contributor, directly or indirectly, to the G20's Energy Efficiency Investment Toolkit. And it's actually from that Benoit mentioned that I'll draw this question. Both of the public financial institutions have talked about the need to embed energy efficiency considerations, and in fact the whole toolkit describes energy efficiency as being a facet of a specific investment, be that a building, an industry, or transport investment. So all of what you've said makes a lot of sense. The toolkit mentions the need for banks to tag the energy performance of their assets in order to give them the visibility to be able to say, I have a mortgage portfolio of which X percentage are A class, X percentage are B class, and so on and so forth. We refer to that as green tagging, which is something that connects to the G20's green agenda, And it also connects to the FSB Financial Task Force's ideas around increased climate disclosure, which I believe will be a big topic together with clearly the toolkit in this year's G20. So my question is this: to those of you from financial institutions and those of you looking at these investments, how well do banks know their own assets and the energy performance of the assets? And if they knew more, would we see more energy efficiency investments taking place?
Great. Let me take a couple, and that's a great one. I have one over here too, and I have a third one there, so I'm going to take three of those. Can we get it? Oh, you have a mic, do you? Yep, please. Yep.
Hello, I'm Olgu Okumuş from Union for the Mediterranean. So I will take the opportunity to be here with distinguished panelists from all over the world to ask my question, because my mandate in the Union for the Mediterranean is to promote cooperation, regional cooperation, and the energy efficiency is one of the main areas. So therefore, I'm hunting successful cases, inspiring cases for our member states. So my question, can you give us examples of concrete, like successful countries, examples who took energy efficiency measures, who developed funds for energy efficiency, and also who accompanied these measures with reforms of subsidies? Thank you.
Parole, Jose wants to talk about bad examples, and you ask him questions for good examples. Let's get that in. Said, please.
Thank you. Said Moulin from Morocco. I'm the head of the Moroccan Agency for Energy Efficiency. In the kingdom, as you heard this morning, we managed to have, for solar plant, for wind program, we managed to attract green financing, development banks, the financing part of it, also grants were coming from the Clean Technology Fund or from also other institutions in Europe. That was an approach that was really a success. For energy efficiency, it's another story. We had the chance with EBRD, and I would say that this MORSEF, Moroccan Sustainable Energy Financial Facility today, is really an example of success story for industry. We are trying to have also financing for farmers today to help them to switch from diesel pump to solar pumps. We are trying to have also loans for citizens, for their households, if they have to invest in energy efficiency. It's another story, and we hope that we managed, especially with development banks, to have more loans dedicated to that, as interesting that what we managed to have for renewables. And we believe that today, and it was mentioned here, that the impact and the social impact of such projects, not only on matter of greenhouse gas emissions, but the social impact is very, very high, and the impact on jobs creation is very, very high also. So what we are pushing today is to have this access to loans dedicated to energy efficiency, like you managed to have, for example, as you mentioned in the African Development Bank, you have this approach for renewable energy. Maybe you need to have a different approach for energy efficiency, more adapted to help local banks, to help also actors in the field of energy efficiency in those countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take one more and then come back to the panel. Santiago.
Thank you, Brian. One very quick question. One of the elements that we're trying to include in energy efficiency finance is innovation. So I would like to ask the panel, how would you actually increase innovation into energy efficiency finance? Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to squeeze in one more. Andy.
Thank you, Brian. Andy from Indonesia. I would like to ask to Gordon, if it is possible to develop a PPP scheme as a business model for energy efficiency. Thank you.
Why don't we start right there? PPPs for energy efficiency.
Yes.
Good. Next.
There are plenty of recent examples that we are piloting in France or in other countries. Again, this comes as from the name of PPP comes, it has to be a cooperation between regulators, local or national governments, and who also need to take some organizational approach to create a sizable enough transaction. If you just leave it to the private sector guy to, for example, persuade all the house owners in an area to get it done, it will take forever, or it's unlikely to happen. So some kind of regulatory support or local government support is needed there. But PPP structures can be managed. PPP structures also mean, every PPP structure depends on the split of risk. How do you allocate risk between the public sector, the private investor, and for example, a household energy efficiency, a retail energy efficiency project, you can allocate some of the risk on the owner of the flat as well. So this spread of risk will decide the pricing and the feasibility of that PPP project. So I think it's right to expect that the private sector, the private funders, and the private construction company takes the usual business risks, which means quality, which can be defined even in the form of KPIs, what kind of performance the building needs to do. And it can be performance driven, like the ESCO companies who actually get their money back from the savings in the wilder forms. But that has strong limitations how far that can go. Or you can do more kind of availability driven, i.e. it's very difficult to measure the actual savings, especially, as I said before, if it's more than just the energy part of the investment. But what you could do, you could have qualitative expectations from the private sector. The building has to meet certain standards, has to maintain that standards over a long period of time. And then the job of the public sector is to measure. So that risk, as well as the risk of financing in interest rates, can be allocated to the private sector. The risk of the cost, you can agree at the beginning how much this project should cost, and if there is a cost overrun or a time overrun, that risk has to be taken by the private sector. What risk should not be taken by the private sector is the regulatory risk, political risk. That's why I suggested this green MIGA idea. But some other forms of national level guarantees could also take care of the regulatory risk. So the regulatory environment should be stable for a long time so that the money can be returned. And then some risk can be taken by the individual owner if it's a retail thing. Like the owner of a building, a private owner, can contribute to the costs, or they can take some form of other risk, like taking a loan and then taking part of the loan and repay that. That's a very theoretical model of how you can allocate it. But getting the right risk allocation will decide the cost and the viability of a PPP structure. Does that answer your question?
Very well, I think. Thank you. Benoit, from the toolkit, how can governments increase or foster innovation in terms of financial institutions or financial products?
There are multiple ways to innovate, and we need to innovate. I think the dialogue organized under the G20 led by Mexico and France, just that is an innovation, and we need a great deal of this type of social innovation, policy innovation, financial instrument innovation to make things happen. So I think there is a room for certainly more, but what we are doing, I think it's part of the innovative approach to the challenge we have. Countries are experimenting, some countries are experimenting some schemes, some mechanism to scale up. The role of international collaboration and this innovation on the policy dialogue is to make sure that at least we have access to information so that the best practices, the innovative solution gets spread rapidly. So I would believe that there is room, and this is also to answer the question from the Union for the Mediterranean. There is typically in the toolkit that the G20 produced, the finance, energy efficiency finance toolkit produced, there is a special book on just case studies for successful energy efficiency finance scheme around the world, and lessons are being drawn from this skill. So this is where I see innovation play a role.
Kevin, there was an interesting question there from Morocco about different approaches in different places and the role of local banks, and that across the region you deal with, how varied does your approach take, or how much do you apply the same kind of approach across the region?
Okay, thank you. For us, what we've done to address the issue you've raised, is actually we've developed an Africa Green Facility, green financing facility, that we work with local banks to basically on-lend to the banks, so giving them lines of credit so that they can also then on-lend to small projects that will deal on renewable energy. This small renewable energy that without aggregation, it becomes very difficult to handle. And then also for energy efficiency programs. In the different countries in Africa, of course, Morocco is very different. It's in its own pack for energy efficiency and also in renewable energy. There are different countries where the policies are not yet there, and also even the capacity to, so you have to start from a capacity development for the government officials to even understand what you're talking about and how to be able to deal with it. So basically it's very heterogeneous. But we have some good examples like South Africa, like Morocco, Egypt, and some other countries where there are some case studies that we're also trying to scale up. And what we do on the continent is when we identify good cases on the continent, then we try to actually get other countries to actually learn from that particular good case that has come up there. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Colleagues, you have your last chance to vote in one of our polls, which has just gone live on the conference app, and the question is, who is best placed to maximise the scaling up of energy efficiency globally, which is very much picking up on these kind of questions. Now, Josue, I wanted to come to you about this question that came up about green tagging or equivalent things. You deal with a lot of banks in a lot of countries, and what kind of ways do you encourage them to understand the energy efficiency dimension of their investments?
Well, let's say the first part is, the first priority is really the identification of the business opportunity. Because at the end of the day, particularly if you deal with private sector commercial banks, they are looking at their bottom line. And unless you're able to show that energy efficiency financing is actually a line of business, like another one, that may require some investment at the beginning, but afterwards, then you don't move. So that's, I would say, a general observation. The second point, I think, on green tagging, a lot of what we do, we want to ensure that the money that is being lent and then on-lent by that bank is actually going for the purpose of energy efficiency. And I think it's a point that Gordon mentioned several times, that, you know, if you have in particular transactions in which you have an energy efficiency component that is together with some other component, you know, you want to be sure thing. So, in a way, in the transactions that we do with those banks, the tagging has to be there in order to ensure that when you do the MRV of that operation, you can actually result, you know, to money. I would say, would tagging and the result change? Our own observation when we look at the way this business develops within local private banks is that strategy decision is what really makes the big difference, not tagging, right? It is the moment when, you know, the business, you know, the CEO or, you know, chief operating officer sees this energy efficiency business is something real, and we are therefore going, you know, to develop this business. It is much more than the tagging, because the tagging, quite frankly, often doesn't reach that level. Maybe to Mr. Moulin, to the question, and I think also to the innovation question, and sticking to this point on the local banks. The innovation, for example, and to your point, is actually in the relationship with the banks. And what we've noticed over the 10 years that we've been doing this is you do have an internal cycle of innovation in the relation with the banks and in the nature of the products of those banks. Generally speaking, we will start with industrial energy efficiency, because bigger projects, the client is more well known, the credit is known, and you'll start with that. You may then move to commercial, space, so shopping centers, kind of retail shops, etc. And then you move, I think it was the commissioner from California mentioned that, to the residential, which is, the most complicated, and the one where the transaction costs are very high, and where, finding a business model that works and corresponds to the returns expectation of a commercial bank is the most difficult. But we managed to move there because of the confidence that it built step by step on each of the previous products, okay? And that's how, with the innovation, you bring new product based on the confidence, based on results that have been achieved with the previous product.
Okay. Thank you. We have time for one very quick last question from Brazil. Ricardo, as quick as you could, please.
Thank you very much. I would just, I got your point on regulation. I would like just to address the exchange rate risk. Could you say a few words on that? I mean, how exchange rate risk can affect those private investments, and how to deal with that?
Well, very quick, but then you may have different. It's local currency financing, and that's one of the challenges that certainly we have, is how to develop that capacity to do, because in many cases, unless you're financing a business that's export-oriented and that's earning foreign exchange, if you're lending to urban infrastructure energy efficiency, where the fares on the bus, are in local currency, you have that issue. That is why we put a lot of emphasis on trying to develop the capacity to fund in local currency and operate in local currency. It's easier said than done.
Jaco, on that or a previous point, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close.
Yeah, no, I can underwrite the same. We are doing quite a lot of business in emerging markets and are facing with the forex risk. And where possible, we try to work with local financial institutions so that at the local level you can match the liabilities and the assets. That is probably the most sustainable solution. In many cases, we have been able to hedge. But in other cases we cannot hedge, and then I think you have to look in that whole value chain and make sure that the strongest shoulders carry the risk, so that you don't put it on the individual project or on the small and medium enterprise or the person who's owning a house. And so, but it is difficult to attract investors who want to carry that risk. But we can see from other sectors that we have often done that successfully, like the TCX facility, for example, which I can tell you more about if you want. Just I want to make one more remark on the first questions that were asked. I know that you're pressing me for time, but I think the question that Peter asked is are we tracking or tagging the energy performance, and the answer was it is very important from the EBRD, and I totally agree, that you start with that high-level strategy, that high-level intention. But if you take yourself seriously, it means that you then define what you want to achieve, both in terms of financial results as well as in terms of impact, and so also in terms of energy performance. So what we try to do is have that framework, also an impact framework, where we ultimately measure CO2 avoided. And the difficulty we have is in some cases data quality. So there is still some work to do. In the Netherlands, there's a very interesting initiative called Platform Carbon Accounting Financials, where jointly with some pension funds, some insurance companies, some asset managers, as well as banks, we are trying to do both things, improve that carbon accounting framework, as well as the data quality that we get.
Friends, thank you. We've had another excellent panel. I'm afraid time is upon us yet again, but we'll have time in the cocktail afterwards to further probe all of these issues. So we're moving to our closing session. Please stay with me just for the duration. Before I hand you over, just have a round of applause for our really excellent panel. And to introduce our special closing address, I'm going to invite the Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, to come to the podium, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a whole day. We had very good discussions. I did open this very meeting, and I was very enthusiastic and very excited about this meeting because at the IEA we organize many meetings on oil, gas, climate. It is relatively easy to bring so many experts, ministers, decision makers to those meetings, but up to now it was not very easy to bring such distinguished people to this energy efficiency meeting. I am about 30 years with the energy industry, working on energy issues. To my knowledge, it is the most significant energy efficiency conference ever held. So therefore, we are very happy, and I would like to also congratulate this Brian and his team, but I am looking for the third one to be better than this one, Brian. So this is, don't be too happy too quickly. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we discuss many issues, heard the policymakers, industry perspectives, experts, the finance issue, policy issue. We are going to finish with a country where a lot of things are happening in the energy sector, which is Mexico. Mexico started energy reforms a few years ago, and those reforms, as they called Mexico energy reform, are substantial. In the oil and gas business, opening the industry, putting clean energy accent very strongly, making major energy trade agreements, and also taking climate change very seriously and being one of the front runners as far as the fight against climate change is concerned. Mr. Secretary Joachim Caldwell, who is the leader of this energy reform, is a very good friend of the IEA, and I told him, Mr. Secretary, when I look at these reforms, what they call the energy sector reform, the depth and the width of that reforms, it will be, in my humble view, it will be wrong to call it as a reform. They are basically a revolution happening in Mexico today. We are saying Mexico is going from a closed country to opening up the energy sector and making energy efficiency, clean energy, as top priorities for the energy sector. We are extremely fortunate that one of the leaders of that reform process is with us today, Mr. Leonardo Beltran, who is the Deputy Secretary for Planning and Energy Transition. I am sure you will all agree with me that it is a privilege to hear from Leonardo what Mexico is doing and what Mexico wants to do in the next years to come. So please join me to welcome Leonardo Beltran. Leonardo.
Well, with that introduction, you can say that Fatih and I, we have become very good friends. Indeed, it's a privilege for me to be here to address this audience. Of course, Secretary Joaquin, the Secretary of Energy from Mexico, would like to convey his regards. I want to congratulate you, Fatih, for the vision you have imprinted to the agency. To Brian, the opportunity for working together to raising the impact awareness and the importance of energy efficiency in the international arena. And, having heard during this whole day different stakeholders, from private sector participants, from the viewpoints of different countries, what's important and what are the key lessons that we have to share in this forum. It's very encouraging to see that the world is moving forward towards a more sustainable future. So we heard best practices, of course, from EU, from Indonesia, from Morocco. We learned about initiatives in Brazil, Argentina, the leadership of Argentina within the G20. And I would like to share with you a little bit of what has been taking place in Mexico. Indeed, we heard loud and clear about the proposition of this energy revolution in Mexico. It is. We just changed the entire face of the energy sector in Mexico. We were coming from a closed, compact, publicly sector-driven energy sector towards a competitive market. Mexico, and just to give you a sense of what was all about in Mexico, I will share with you a little bit of what was going on in Mexico and the different initiatives that have driven the energy revolution. So Mexico had a significant demographic transformation over the last years, characterized mainly by an increase in population, migration from rural to urban areas, where more than 7 of every 10 Mexicans live. By 2030, we are expecting to have 9 out of every 10 Mexicans living in cities. So that will create pressure in urban areas. We will have approximately, we will come from 300 cities to around 400, 450 cities in the next 15 years. And this urbanization, as we have heard, creates challenges and opportunities to meet a growing energy demand of the residential, the commercial, and industrial sectors, as well as greater opportunities for private investment in infrastructure to face the requirements of electricity supply, of mobility, of public services, and of a standard of living in general. Currently, Mexico in the energy sector is responsible for 40% of total emissions, of which electricity contributes to 25%, and oil and gas around 13%. So in order to contribute to reducing our carbon footprint and promoting a more sustainable sector, in the framework of the energy revolution in December 2015, the Energy Transition Act was published, in which we highlighted the importance of clean energy and energy efficiency. For the first time in Mexico, we are assigning the same importance to clean generation and to energy efficiency, assigning the clear value of the hidden fuel of energy efficiency. And in order to fulfill these objectives, we developed and published an energy transition strategy to promote the use of technology and cleaner fuels. The goal of clean energy is to ensure by 2024 that 1 out of every 3 megawatts consumed comes from clean energy sources, and by 2050, at least half of it should come from clean energies. In terms of energy efficiency, we have also set goal of reducing energy intensity of final consumption. And every year, from last year up to 2030, we will aim to reduce 1.9% our energy intensity. And from 2030 up to 2050, once we have developed the infrastructure and the momentum, we will try to double that level of ambition up to 3.7% per year. So that leading us to, by 2050, to consume half of what we are consuming today, and that half should come from clean energy. And according with this planning instrument, to achieve these goals, we published a couple of policies. One, promoting energy transition, basically clean energy and innovation, and the other, the sustainable use of energy. This second program emphasizes particular policies for regulation, standardization, labeling, cooperation mechanisms. International cooperation is key. And here I would like to highlight the help of the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation. Not only important for lessons learned and best practices, but also to encourage, for instance, financial mechanisms to promote energy efficiency, strengthening institutional capacity, changing the culture of the sustainable use of energy, and of course, technology development to habilitate the consumption of energy efficiency as a fuel. Through this program, we are promoting policies on strengthening the standardization system, the replacement of inefficient equipment by high-tech appliances. In terms of financing the energy transition, we are devoting resources and financial mechanisms to promote in small and medium enterprises, which more than 99% of the industry it's composed of in Mexico. For households, we have developed lighting, sustainability practices in terms of construction of buildings, and incorporating into the building codes energy conservation measures. For municipalities, which is another of the key challenges, we are promoting, of course, energy efficiency in lighting, but in general, sustainability programs that tackle services provided by municipalities. This is public lighting, public or water pumping systems, public buildings, transportation, and waste management. We have set up, with the help of the World Bank, a credit line to promote these type of initiatives and to create a bonus for municipalities that incorporate these new practices into their service provision. And for large companies, we are developing a voluntary system in which they develop some targets, voluntary targets, in order to incorporate and promote the ISO 50001s. So basically, in a nutshell, what we are doing is learning from experience, from the lessons learned and best practice that has been shared with the International Energy Agency. We have incorporated all of these lessons and best practices into our domestic policies, and with technical help and this comprehensive set of reforms that we have pushed forward in Mexico, we are leading into a more sustainable energy future, which is basically the main element of the transformation that President Peña Nieto is putting forward. With that, I would like to again congratulate the vision of Mr. Virol in raising the value proposition of the International Energy Agency, convening power of the agency given his leadership, and of course to Mr. with Brian, the opportunity to partner with them and make sure that energy efficiency is no longer a hidden fuel, but and not only a low-hanging fruit, but fruit that can be picked up from the ground. Thank you very much, and congratulations for a successful and hopefully, or definitely, you will have a challenge, but an opportunity to have a more successful event next year. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. So, with this excellent speech and with the action, we see what's happening in this a large country like Mexico, which gives us a lot of hope for the future for Mexico, but beyond that, we are coming to the end of our meeting. So I would like to thank, first of all the speakers, all the colleagues here following this very conference. And I heard from my colleagues that it was very popular, the live broadcasting of this event. I would like to also thank Mr. Sadomari, who is our Director for Energy Markets, Brian Motherway, Mel, Lucy, and all the energy efficiency team. Just that you know, I have invited the energy efficiency team tomorrow, my office, for a champagne drink. So we are going to celebrate this very meeting. But as of Monday, they are going to start for the third conference. And what I promised today, an online platform to exchange information in terms of the legislations in different sectors of energy efficiency policies, monitoring, impact assessment, best practices. We want to integrate this in November. Once again, thank you very much to all of you, and we are very happy to invite you for a drink outside of this room. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening. Thank you.